And welcome to the Equal Opportunity Committee's second meeting of 2013. Can I remind everyone to set electronic devices to either flight mode or switch them off completely. We have apologies this morning from Siobhan McMahon, MSP, who is stuck in traffic on the M8. There have been two very bad accidents this morning. Our only agenda item today is an evidence session on where gypsy travellers live with witnesses representing support services, including voluntary organisations, health workers and the police. And can I start this morning by getting everyone introduced? And as we're having a round-table evidence session, our members are sitting alongside witnesses around the table. And at the table we also have our clerking and research team together with official reporters. And around the room we are supported by broadcasting services and the security office. Can I also welcome the observer sitting in the public gallery at the rear of the room? My name is Mhairi and I'm the committee's convener, and can I now ask all members and witnesses to introduce themselves in turn, starting on my right.
Good morning, I'm Gavin Buist, Vice President of the Association of Scottish Police Superintendents.
Good morning, my name is Helen Watson, I'm Head of Planning, Health Improvement and Commissioning, and I work for an NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
Good morning, I'm Dennis Robertson, MSP for Aberdeenshire West.
Morning, my name is Mhairi. I'm a support and development worker for Shelter.
My name is Alec Johnston. I'm a member of the Scottish Parliament for North East Scotland.
Good morning, my name is Nigel, Firth, Equality and Diversity Manager, NHS Grampian and NHS Orkney.
Morning, my name is Kathryn Hilditch, Training and Mediation Manager of Planning Aid for Scotland.
Marco Biaggi, MSP for Edinburgh Central.
Alex Jarrett, Chief Inspector with Fife Constabulary, presently Chair of the ACPOS Gypsy Traveller Reference Group.
John Mason, I'm the MSP for Glasgow Shettleston.
I'm Michelle Lloyd, Manager with MECOPP.
Neil Mackay, Lothian and Borders Police Diversity Unit.
Pauline, Padfield, Scottish Traveller Education Programme.
Good morning, Lynne, Tammi, National Co-ordinator of Article 12 in Scotland.
Matt Brad, John Finney, MSP Highlands and Islands.
Thank you everyone for that. What we hear this morning will help us to better understand how gypsy travellers' living arrangements may affect their access to support services and their interactions with the police, and it will feed into our inquiry as we move forward. Now, committee members have a number of questions for the witnesses, and I'm going to start with John Mason and then move on to Marco Biaggi.
Thanks, Convener. I think the area I wanted to touch on was that we've had quite a lot of evidence so far, and it would appear that the permanent sites, which people are living on permanently, are more straightforward in some respects, but it's what are often called unauthorised encampments, where people are temporarily there, that there have been more issues. So I think I was wanting to ask the folk we've got this morning what their experience has been of working with gypsy travellers on unauthorised encampments.
Yes, I'll go first, representing ASPs. I mean, my comments are very general and are really representative of some consultation I did of my colleagues before coming to this committee. I think we're all familiar around the table with the policing problems that unauthorised encampments present. And I'm happy to speak about that in more detail, but I suspect from the agenda item that's maybe not what we'd like to focus on initially. I think the difficulty, however, that the police face in dealing with these encampments is, first of all, we are under significant pressure from landowners, we are under significant pressure often from local media, who will take a particular stance and view of unauthorised encampments. That can then create difficulties in trying to put together any kind of sophisticated response to the people who are actually encamped in that kind of situation. I'm very conscious that that very itinerant lifestyle does create problems in terms of accessing health, accessing school, accessing council services and so on. Unfortunately, given the nature of our encounters with the people on the sites, it would be nice to get to that level of conversation with them. The various pressures and forces which are acting on myself and my colleagues can often make that conversation very difficult. But it's a much more sophisticated challenge than simply trying to move people on. That's not really a solution in the longer term.
Mr Firth, did you want to come in?
Yes. In Grampian we have one permanent site at Clinterty. Now that has very good links with our local GP practices. It enables us to put in community nursing, health visitor, community midwife support, and it makes screening and immunisation programmes much more simple. The problem our staff face with the unauthorised encampments, for want of a better phrase, is that our staff can go out to an encampment 1 week, return to do follow-up care the next, and find that the encampment occupants have been served with an eviction notice and have been moved on. And that makes providing continuity of healthcare very difficult and very challenging. And as we know, the Gypsy Traveller community as a whole enjoys far poorer health than the settled community, and they are a priority area where we need to be putting in more resources. But certainly the present arrangements with the shortage of permanent and also a shortage of temporary halting sites makes the provision of healthcare very difficult.
Yes, Mr Jarrett.
We're starting to see some of the stresses that appear between public agencies in the response to unauthorised encampments. I think the police services has reviewed its response to unauthorised encampments and the guidance that we've had from the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. We still have the presumption against prosecution, which is slightly widened towards, it used to be the Trespass Act 1865, but it probably encompasses Road Scotland Act and other ancillary legislation that may affect an unauthorised encampment. I think where we're moving to now is not looking through a prism of prosecution, but more in terms of mainstreaming the police response to unauthorised encampments. I think sometimes historically we've been forced down because of the competing pressures between landowners, other services, towards the presumption of we would try to prosecute and move people on. We're looking to mainstream, and there's a lot of work going on just now in the Scottish Police Service, to how do we mainstream our service provision to those in unauthorised encampments, if you want to use that word, and also those in the permanent sites. Now, the argument for how many sites we've got in Scotland, whether temporary sites or permanent sites, is for others to look at that landscape in the travelling community. We're doing some work just now to, anecdotally, we think there haven't been as many reports of unauthorised encampments over the past 2 or 3 years. It looks like it's starting to kind of diminish slightly, but we're looking to validate our figures and to see why that is, and to look at our response from a police service point of view. But importantly, we're looking to mainstream our service provision, and there is some work in enhanced community engagement going on in some areas of Scotland. And I know in Fife we have put in place an enhanced community engagement model where we look to bring people together in a community, a whole diverse community. So where there are permanent traveller sites there, we've had some success in bringing members of the Gypsy Traveller community to our community engagement meetings. And we see that as a big success, to bring communities together, to start to discuss the issues together at a ground level and not have us arbitrating continually between groups. We want the groups to come together and develop local solutions in a local kind of environment themselves. So I think perhaps from a police perspective, we would like to move towards let's look at this not through a prism of prosecution for everybody when they look at us and come to the police, but look at us through a provision of mainstreaming service provision and what we can do to assist to support the Equalities Act, ECHR, in supporting the Gypsy Traveller community.
Could I just come in on that again? Thanks, Convener. I mean, we had an example, I think it was last week, from East Lothian, that when there was an encampment, police tried to visit quite quickly and I think try and build up a relationship. Now, I'm not sure if that was just whoever happened to be the local police or whatever, but would that be a common picture, that would try and do that?
Yes, our guidance is that we will get a report fairly quickly of an unauthorised encampment, and we would move to quickly go and make contact with the Gypsy Travellers on that unauthorised encampment, with a view to ask, we are quite openly, who are you, how many vehicles are here, we will work with the public authority, but I come back to that, not with the presumption to prosecute, but with the presumption to bring in support services, but to work with their partners. Now, that's where the message can sometimes get confused, because you'll understand there's a great deal of kind of distrust in certain kind of groups and wariness when we work with the police, not only in the Gypsy Traveller community, but in members of the settled community. So we go very quickly, not with a view to moving people on, but assessing whether there are any public issues there in terms of health, danger, perhaps obstruction issues. And once we've had a look at that in the round, we will then report that to our local liaison, public authority liaison officer, who will then make contact and we will hand over to them. But that we don't kind of abrogate ourselves from any responsibility in terms of any crimes or offences that may take place. But in terms of the encampment itself, we're just there to make sure that the travellers are supported. We have all the information we need to work with our partners, and that should be done within 1 or 2 days.
Dennis Robertson has a supplementary on that point, and then I'll bring you in.
Thanks, Convener. Just a very brief supplementary. We did hear in evidence last week that there could be, or sometimes are, occasions when the police are actually reluctant to go and visit. And that was certainly heard in evidence last week. Would you support that claim?
Can I come in on that one, please?
Yes.
Yeah. I could probably try and tie those 2 points up together. Just to confirm your question, there is a designated police Gypsy Traveller liaison officer in East Lothian, as there are the borders, West Lothian and City of Edinburgh. I was on the ground 3 weeks ago, and I can confirm that it's not on. Efforts are made for the police Gypsy Traveller liaison officer and their council counterpart to go and engage at the first opportunity. I've seen that in practice. Reluctant to take action, not in my experience, I'd have to say.
Actually reluctant to actually go and actually engage or to even visit. That was the claim last week that we were hearing.
No, I perhaps don't have the overview of the Scottish picture that my police colleagues do, but Lothian and Borders, I haven't heard that before.
Jarrett, did you want to come in, and then I'll bring in.
I think I haven't witnessed any reluctance to go to any unauthorised encampments. Our guidance and procedures are clear, and they will be publicly available. They've just been reviewed in that we will go, we will interact with members of the Gypsy Traveller community in unauthorised encampment. We will take details and we will pass them on. All forces will have liaison officers of some form or degree within their kind of make-up and their framework, and they will have a contact with local authorities and others. So it's not my experience that there's been a reluctance to go. We're working with officers. We have a professional development programme that's getting looked at just now to give staff and officers more skills in the same way as we would deal with other minority groups and hard-to-reach groups. So there's work going on to give officers more skills in the interaction they have and to make it a more fruitful interaction. But certainly in terms of we get a call, it's all recorded electronically. We have databases and that. There should be no reason whatsoever that there's any tardy response.
I'll go to Lynne, Tammi, and then I'll bring in Mhairi Craig. Lynne.
Kind of moved on a bit from the question that I was going to ask you. So I would just like to raise a point of what's just been discussed and was raised by Dennis Robertson there in terms of reluctance. That's certainly not our experience either. And we've done quite a bit of work with what was Grampian Police and Jim Hume in particular. And I would say that there's been good attempts there to connect with the community in whatever way. The point you made about the work that you're doing and enhanced community engagement and what have you, I'm just wondering how you square that with members of the settled community.
We don't see it as it's a response to our community in the whole. And any community, whether settled or otherwise, will have component parts and different cultural differences. We have Eastern Europeans, we have members with Southeast Asia in our communities. We work with them. The fact that they are so-called settled really doesn't matter to us. We have permanent Gypsy Traveller sites. We've got 3 in Fife. We work with those groups, and we'll see that as a conduit to access other Gypsy travellers who have a more kind of movement-orientated lifestyle. So we don't see there's any difference. In terms of any stresses between settled community and the Gypsy Traveller community, that's why we want people to come together in a single forum to discuss issues at a local area, because those permanent sites, well, they'll have the same issues accessing services. They'll still have quality of life issues that members of the settled community will have, and it is their community in the round that we want them to come together. And we think that by bringing people together and working together, that's when we get all these kind of misconceptions ironed out and we forge relationships. It's not for us to force it upon people, but to act as a conduit to bring them together. And I don't see our response as any different in any way to the settled or the Gypsy Traveller community.
I've got 3 more witnesses wanting to come in, and I've got Mhairi, Craig, Helen, Watson, and then Pauline, Padfield. Mhairi.
I just want to say what Lynne was saying. In my experience with East Lothian, I've had extensive contact with the police liaison officer, Rona, and we're actually having a meeting with the inspector next week. And they've been very keen to engage with both the settled community and with roadside travellers, and also engage with agencies like myself and the local authority.
Thanks for that.
Thank you. Just on behalf of the NHS in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, we have an operational approach where we are very, very keen to engage with so-called unauthorised camps. And I have to say that we span 6 local authority areas. All of those local authority areas, in both their social work departments and their departments of education, are also keen. We've been trying to develop a model of approach because we know that there are quite strong issues of trust within the Gypsy Traveller community against the statutory services for very good reasons. And what we are finding is that the level of engagement and trust seems to be very much augmented in relation to the relationship and the stigma and the attitudes of the wider settled community. So the Gypsy Traveller experience of the settled community actually has an impact on our ability to engage with them.
Thank you for that. Pauline.
In these sorts of discussions, there's always this dichotomy that emerges between settled and gypsy travellers. And it's really important to bear in mind that a lot of gypsy travellers are part of the settled community. And so it's not really helpful to juxtapose it in that way. And what you mentioned about dialogue and engagement, of course, those sorts of issues emerge, but it's really important that people bear that in mind. I just wanted to say that.
I mean, I know throughout the evidence sessions we have had a fair amount of evidence about gypsy travellers that are part of the settled community, and I've lived in the settled community for a number of years. Alex Johnson, did you want to come in just now as we're on we've talked a lot about the police?
It was my intention to explore some of the issues surrounding the police and how they deal with gypsy travellers. And I have to say that we've covered quite a lot of that ground already. There was a couple of things come up, however, that I thought I could take the opportunity to just clarify. And these relate to the terms that are used when we're describing how we behave. And one that I think Jarrett used quite a lot was mainstreaming. Now, I think I understand what you meant by that, but I wondered if you would like to explain exactly what you meant by mainstreaming.
I think it's the point that Dr. Padfield made, that we're sometimes, because of the language you use and the pressures we're up upon, is to treat gypsy travellers as this entity in a silo. And everything we do is focused towards this silo, whether it's unauthorised encampments, other provision of public services, as if they are a part out with the community. And what I'm saying is that they're a part of the community, just as we can use terms like settled, gypsy traveller, those that are settled, those that are kind of roadside travelling. But the bottom line here is these are members of our community. And when I say mainstreaming, it's when I mentioned we're continually being forced to look at it through the prism of enforcement. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't, everything we should do should be proportionate and legal and necessary, but we should look at gypsy travellers in the round and the way we would do with mainstream society, the settled community. And that's what I'm saying is when we talk about community engagement with them, it's in the same way as we would deal with any other cultural group with some differences in our community, and how we mainstream that our response to those communities, and we bring the Gypsy Travellers in and acknowledge cultural differences, but start to work with them, to work with, and I'll use the term, the settled community, because we have settled sites, permanent sites, which are part of our community, part of our settled community. We have many Gypsy Travellers who live in our settled community, and we have to start bringing those people in to mainstream service provision, to empower them to raise their voice at a local level. I hope that kind of makes it a bit more clearer.
Thanks for that. Gavin and then Michelle.
Yeah, I think I would just want to echo what Alec has said. I think personally, I don't find the mainstream media portrayal of Gypsy Travellers particularly helpful in fostering relationships between the broader community and that particular group in the community. It does tend to shape the views of what I think I'll try and call the settled community, particularly if an unauthorised or street encampment does appear. And as I mentioned earlier, that does bring its own particular dynamic in terms of the police response and individuals who try to shape the way that response is delivered. I think Neil made a valid point, though, about the value of liaison officers. In my own experience is if a liaison officer is established and that officer is allowed to remain in post, then they can develop a very, very close working relationship with people who use particularly the fixed sites. In terms of mainstreaming, I think I draw some comfort from the history of policing in this respect and with regard to diversity. I think we have a way to go in building up the relationship of trust, which Neil's talked about, Alex talked about, and which is clearly very, very important. But I draw some comfort from the fact that if we look back maybe 20 years ago at the police relationship with LGBT people, that wasn't good. And I think no one around the table would agree with that. 20 years on, it is light years better than it ever was. So we can do it. And I think this is a particularly challenging community for a number of reasons, which I think this group would acknowledge. But I think if we persist in the direction of travel that Alex articulated a couple of times, then I would like to think we will reach the stage where we have a better relationship, where there's a trusting relationship, and where that can form the basis of interventions and support from other statutory bodies.
Thank you for that. I've got Michelle, Lloyd, and then Kathryn, Hilditch, and then Dennis, did you want to come back in?
Yeah. Firstly, I'm encouraged to hear that there are examples of community engagement, and I would hope that that can become more widespread across the country and not just one example of good practice. I think it's particularly important because the relationship between Gypsy Travellers and the police needs to be seen in a slightly wider perspective. Too often in the past, and I think we're in danger of doing it this morning, it's just seen in policing and Gypsy Travellers are solely seen in terms of what's called unauthorised or roadside encampments. But actually there's a need to build trust, not least because Gypsy Travellers, like any other members of our community, are also very often the victims of crime. And those of us working with the community, and I'm sure perhaps some police officers also know that very often crimes that are committed against the community, whether that's individually or collectively, are not reported. That could be something as simple as a theft or an attack, or it could be something much more serious when there are attacks on camps across the country. So it's encouraging to hear, but it would be great if it could be rolled out effectively.
Thanks for that, Michelle. Kathryn, Hilditch.
Planning perspective, community engagement is obviously becoming a really much more important part of the planning process, and we found that Gypsy Travellers are a group that maybe aren't so engaged in the planning process. So I think there's really a need throughout planning to really engage with Gypsy Travellers and really find out what their accommodation needs are, whether that be temporary sites or settled sites, but really making sure that we really know what their needs are by doing engagement in whatever way is necessary to really find out what those needs are. I'm thinking about really interactive ways of engaging with them.
Thanks for that. Dennis, did you want to come back in supplementary? And do you have anything else, Alex? Okay.
I'll come back in after Alex.
Okay. Alex Johnson.
What I was going to do was then sort of extend the question slightly, and again it refers to a point that Alec Jarrett raised, and that was when he mentioned the presumption against prosecution. Now that's a phrase that I've heard used many times by many police forces, What I wondered was, firstly, the extent to which that presumption against prosecution operates, and then perhaps more importantly, whether you see that as a supporting element of the principle of mainstreaming, or whether you see it as an exception to the mainstreaming argument.
The presumption against, as I mentioned earlier, prosecution came from Scottish Government guidance that was then formed by the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service in terms of guidelines to the police service, and that was generally in terms of the Trespass Act 1865 relating to trespassing on property and land. And there are certain kind of criteria around that where local authorities have alternatives to that in terms of public safety, and if you want I can give you the actual detail of that. But primarily is, unless there are certain kind of criteria met, the presumption is there's no prosecution against gypsy travellers in an unauthorised encampment. We see that as really quite supportive to the police service because it allows us guidelines to formulate we can give to landowners, and we have standard operating procedures that are now getting rolled out across the greater police service. They were replicated almost word for word throughout Scotland in any case. That dictates that response. So when you said a police officer goes to an authorised encampment, they will take certain details, and whether it's public land or private land, they will then have guidance on how to interact with the landowner, and we have template letters that sets out the law, which includes the presumption against prosecution in certain circumstances, which we will give to landowners and work with them, and that's why we have a framework in place to work with the local authorities when we pass these details on, and it's then for the local authority to go and work with the gypsy travellers, and then they will decide whether eviction in the round will take place or not, or whether they will facilitate them moving on. So we, from my personal opinion, I see the guidelines that we've got and the guidance that we got from the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service as helpful, because it clarifies our position and it clarifies the position of partners in our response to unauthorised encampments.
You want to come back in on that? No. Lynne, did you want to come in on that point specifically?
A couple of points. Picking up from Gavin there, you mentioned mainstream media. We completely agree with you on that point. We're doing a bit of research over 4 years around how the mainstream media reports on the gypsy traveller community. Just another point, so as you rightly said, that is how many people shape their views on groups that they don't understand the culture or whatever of. And I noted that I was reading the notes of the last meeting, and that came up a lot, people saying they don't understand, they don't know enough about the community, they want to learn about the community, the opportunities aren't there. The opportunities really are there if people will look. And I noticed there was mention from people in Aberdeen and the Shire about there not being opportunities to learn about the culture. Well, we've actually had an exhibition going around that area for the past 4 months, which was put together by young gypsy travellers, and that was widely publicised. It was in the mainstream dailies and weeklies, so I find it difficult to see why people can say that there aren't the opportunities around to learn about the culture when it's clearly there. And the exhibition is actually going to be for another 2 weeks at Aberdeen City Main Library. So anybody that's here from the region, if they haven't seen it and want to learn a bit more, it's there for people to go and look at.
Pauline, Padfield?
The stats from the Scottish Traveller Education Programme website show that most of the hits we get, in fact, are to find out about travelling people. So that was quite surprising, but there is an interest. Part of the difficulty, I think, in enabling people to understand the different cultures is how do you actually meet travelling people? Because we get calls at step and, you know, it's as if you're to have a draw and you pull out. And the diversity among gypsy travellers is the same as in any group. So there is a difficulty there. And what Lynne's mentioned about the exhibition is really important, and I know MECOPP have just had and have an exhibition which is extremely moving, that is very good at explaining to people what it is to be a gypsy traveller in Scotland today. So possibly more of that is needed and across Scotland.
Dennis, did you want to come back in with a supplementary on that?
That's fine, thank you. Basically, I sincerely hope the witnesses are aware that this committee is determined to try and seek answers to many of the questions that are being posed, and I think through that determination, I sincerely hope we are able to make a difference. On the aspect of some of the policing matters, we tend to know that the gypsy travelling communities have a fairly set pattern of travel and a fairly set pattern of location. So, the fact that many sites are no longer available to gypsy travelling communities, it seems to me that they have very little alternative than to use unauthorised encampments. Is the solution to try and ensure that every authority then sets up permanent sites, given that we know where gypsy travelling communities tend to go? And the point was made by yourself, I think, that quite often we try to ensure that there's an engagement for schools, education, health, etc. Many of the travelling communities and gypsy travelling people, certainly those with children, I think are very keen to ensure that the children go to school. And what we find is that many of the sites are away from public transport, quite often outside settled communities, so it actually makes it much more difficult. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about the integration aspect. And, when they do travel, quite often it's during school holidays.
Can I?
Yeah. Yes, certainly.
Thank you. I think integration would certainly help. Although I have to say that in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde we do have good relationships with the local authorities. I think I would pull us back though to the point about the local communities, the settled communities and their approach to the gypsy travellers as well, because that does get in the way, and it is largely informed by the media as well, the local media. I think some of the reports that we see in particularly the local papers, if it was relating to another ethnic minority, it would be quite clearly illegal and it would be quite clearly unacceptable. And I don't think that gypsy travellers are actually afforded that same respect. So certainly, I think it would be helpful to have proper campsites in every local authority area. I think that there are questions about having appropriate sites because I don't know enough about the land availability, but I certainly think it's something that's worth trying for. I think it also gives us an opportunity to have a more consistent health record, a more consistent vaccination record. If we're making approaches to gypsy travellers and asking them if we can immunise their children, and their children have already been immunised, it doesn't send out a good signal either. So we don't seem to have proper continuity of care because we don't have the right information infrastructure around that. And when you think about the 4 pillars of health inequalities being health, education, housing and employment, the culture of gypsy travellers can sometimes make these 4 pillars very challenging for the rest of us. So I think integration would certainly help support a stronger approach towards that.
Thank you for that. Kathryn, do you want to come in?
Yes, I think just related to that point, I think there's a lot of assumptions made and a lot of misconceptions about where gypsy travellers do want to live. And obviously they're not a homogenous group, they don't all want to live in the same area, but we did a seminar which was to bring planners and gypsy traveller support workers together. And a lot of planners said to me afterwards that they simply hadn't realised that some gypsy travellers want to be located near towns and near services and schools and things. And there's an assumption that they want to be further away, and actually a lot of people would want to be located close. So again, it's really thinking about how do we find out from people what do they want and what do they need.
Thanks for that. Do any of the other witnesses want to come in on that point? I'll bring in Michelle and then I'll move on to John Finney.
think taking a slightly wider perspective, the policies and practices that we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, I don't think many around this table would disagree that they're certainly outdated, and many would also argue that they're very paternalistic. They were designed as a, inverted commas, a solution to a problem, inverted commas, and the Gypsy Travellers were very much seen as a problem that had to be solved. Hopefully, those days are now gone and we need to be looking forward. And I would argue what's needed is, I don't think there are any quick fix solutions, so I don't think it's a case of perhaps a transit site in every local authority in Scotland or one extra permanent site in every local authority area. I think what's needed is a diverse and very comprehensive accommodation strategy which does take into account the varying needs of the community, because the community's needs have obviously changed over the years in exactly the same way as the rest of the communities within Scotland. Some of the traditional occupations are no longer available. People are looking at have sourced alternative ways of making a living. I think any comprehensive accommodation strategy also has to be very, very closely linked to what I would say is an anti-racist strategy to tackle the attitudes that we're all aware of, not only in the media, I would argue, but also amongst many public authorities and the general public as well. Unless those two things go hand side by side, the accommodation strategy is probably doomed to fail, as previous experience would illustrate. So I think we need a slightly wider view.
To bring in Nigel Firth and then Pauline, did you want to come in?
I just wanted to say, what I wanted to say was what Michelle has just said, and you know, I'm really encouraged to hear about the engagement. I mean, given and the question of racism and what is said about travellers, it is against the law. It doesn't matter that they're not Chinese or African or whatever. It is against the law. So how come that continues? But to just go back and say where the police are often at the front of these kinds of conflict, the fact that there's a dialogue and a preparedness to talk and to have people who get to know and build trust is really, really important. But I cannot reiterate strongly enough what Michelle has just said.
I want to bring in Nigel Firth and then John Finney and John Mason. Nigel.
In Grampian we have good liaison, good cooperation with the local authorities, the police, the NHS, with our local Gypsy Traveller communities. And in 2011 we had a very, very positive dialogue day with a representative cross-section of our local Gypsy Traveller communities. Out of that dialogue day and follow-up work, we have proposals in Aberdeen City for one additional permanent halting site, and an initiative in Aberdeenshire for a new temporary halting site. Now, I think that those are very, very positive initiatives. Obviously, there has to be discussion and between the Gypsy Traveller communities, the statutory bodies and the residents in the areas where these facilities are proposed. But back to a comment made by Helen Watson earlier, the media play a very significant role. Yes, people tend to judge Gypsy Traveller communities by their own personal experiences, many of which are very positive, some of which are negative. But we have had in the past a particular issue in Grampian where one particular newspaper had a drip, drip, drip negative campaign, which actually resulted in the owners of that, proprietors of that newspaper, being brought before this committee and told in very straight terms to quote that their coverage had fallen below an acceptable level of decent reporting in the coverage of gypsies and travellers. That kind of negative campaign doesn't just affect at the time, it has a carry-on, it has a legacy. And I think that we need to, and perhaps this committee taking a leading role in ensuring that where reporting is unacceptable, that those responsible are brought to book quickly.
Because John Finney's been waiting patiently to come in, Dennis, so make it very short.
Very briefly, Convener. Just on the point of the Aberdeen-Aberdeenshire, and I'm aware of it, but I'm also aware of the fact that we took evidence last week from the Community Council from that area, and that was particularly negative in terms of their engagement. And last weekend, the Talk-In programme from which covers the North East area, all we heard basically was Nemeism. So there's an awful long way to go, you know, within Grampian. I hear the positivity that's coming from NHS Grampian, which is absolutely fantastic. But from the radio show, the NIMBYism that was coming from a Talk-In programme was, yeah, okay, we understand people need somewhere to live, but not here.
Do you want to come in on that point, Gavin?
Yeah, I think just in an operational perspective, it's 2 or 3 years since I was a divisional commander, but that last stint I had really was characterised by that. The conversations I had with the local community councils, in the abstract, were very supportive of Gypsy Travellers until the day a roadside encampment appeared. And the rhetoric changed literally overnight from one of general support of the concept to, why are you not taking enforcement action? And that was a stumbling block, and unfortunately we never got beyond that. In the event, we managed through the liaison that Neil and Alec have spoken about to negotiate a move on within 2 or 3 weeks, but it was a lively 2 or 3 weeks within that community. And some of the rhetoric was disturbing.
Yeah. Thanks for that. John Finney and then John Mason.
Thank you, Convener. I think we've heard some very interesting contributions already, and I'm sure there's more to come. My intention was to pose a question to Mr. Buist, and I will come to that if I briefly can comment on a couple of contributions from Kathryn, which I thought are highly pertinent and followed up by Michelle's there. And it is about unauthorised encampments, which is the perennial problem. And I would also like to pose this to Mr. Jarrett too, given the ACPOS hat that he's wearing today as well, and it relates to community planning partnerships, and your members, Mr. Buist, are most likely to be directly involved with local authorities in community planning partnerships. And given problem solving seems to be a very popular term in police circles, if unauthorised encampments are a problem for the police, is this something that's been raised at community planning partnerships with a view to ensuring that these, what the local authority can do by way of perhaps including your comments in the composition of a local development plan, because everyone should be consulted in that. Have your members made representations, and if not, could they make representations? Certainly, and Michelle's right, the answer simply isn't more sites everywhere. It has to be a considered approach, and there may well indeed be beyond local issues and may be a national planning development issue rather than entirely. It's conscious, and forgive me if I noted you incorrectly, Mr. Jarrett, when you sort of certainly use the term for others. I would see that there is a role, and particularly when we move to the single service there, for a more coordinated approach. So have your members made representations, and if not, can you give us an undertaking that you would engage in that basis, please?
Yeah, I think if I can answer the second part of your question first, I think it's absolutely appropriate that representations can be made by our members, and I think you're absolutely right that community planning partnerships are the logical vehicle to initiate that dialogue. I think, though, from what I've picked up around the table, I think senior police officers can play a role. In many respects, they have an interest in doing this because, as I've just mentioned, you can very quickly find yourself behind the 8 ball when you're presented with a roadside encampment, particularly. I think the caveat I would put on that is I think any representation would be much stronger if it was done on a partnership basis with interested individuals locally, interested agencies nationally, trying to progress that local agenda and to get something onto the SOA which would initiate a process which would hopefully in the longer term lead to change. My apologies, this was supposed to be switched off. It's a new phone. My apologies, Chair. And I was going to say saved by the bell, but do we do it just now? There are representations made across the country. If I was to be perfectly frank, Mr. Finney, it is patchy at the moment and it tends to be reactive. Could it be better? I think it probably could be, but my colleague Alec might be better qualified to comment on that basis.
Mr. Jarrett?
In terms of the kind of community planning partnership, the local authorities have the single outcome agreements, which in that there will be short, medium and longer term outcomes, and they will be reducing inequalities, and I'm talking in general terms here, enhancing the health and well-being, and within that the partners will work within the profiles of their area. I can speak, say for instance, in Fife and the Glenrothes area for our outcomes about supporting the community, reducing inequalities, health care, quality of life issues, which are captured in a single outcome agreement. Within that, within these areas that will have either permanent sites or unauthorised encampments, because a comment was made earlier, there can be patterns to these in the kind of the travelling year. We will then respond to that with our community planning partners. So whilst I mentioned we had an enhanced community engagement model that we're piloting in the Glenrothes area, which has a permanent site within it, that strategy will include our response to communicate with, to support the Gypsy Traveller community. So we do work with our community planning partners there within it. In terms of our response nationally for the police service, we are just going through, we've just reviewed our unauthorised encampments guidance, and that included a comprehensive equality impact assessment. And that impact assessment has had the SOP, the Standard Operating Procedure, commented on by liaison officers, local authority members, public partners, Scottish Gypsy Traveller Movement, everyone we could. We researched current kind of ECHR, equalities, the steps, MECOPP work that was done, and it has been found fit for purpose. That's in terms of response to unauthorised encampments from our perspective. So we are working, in terms of the ACPOS Gypsy Travellers Reference Group, we have acknowledged that we're moving on to a different policing landscape, that things have moved on probably over the last few decades in terms of our response. As Gavin mentioned earlier, how do we kind of make relations better with the Gypsy Traveller community? So we're mapping good practice throughout Scotland to identify good practice within the police service and out with it. We're looking to map, within reason, is there a pattern to unauthorised encampments that we can then take to work with our public sector partners to say, let's stop being ad hoc, as you say, let's take it to the kind of the planning table, because just to say we shall set up another couple of permanent sites and some transit sites, if you don't take into consideration the Gypsy Traveller community, their needs, their travelling lifestyle, then it's unlikely to get used the way you want. So there is work going on in that vein at the moment.
Well, thanks for that. I'm not sure how I would translate any of that into any sort of meaningful language for some of the Gypsy travellers that I have contact with who have concerns about traditional stopping off places no longer being available. So, as regards the policing landscape and mapping, this is not a recent issue. How is that going to transfer into something meaningful? Because we keep hearing that all the local authorities, they know the places where the unauthorised encampments are. It would seem to me, yes, for 32 responses, you say, well, we'll not need... It doesn't seem to lead a lot of, at the end of the day, travellers aren't so much interested in policies about equality issues. They really just want somewhere to park up their van, and it can be as simple as that. So, as Dennis said, we're very keen to ensure that there's something meaningful rather than just yet another report comes out of this committee. So is it something that you could give any time frame that the police service in Scotland could look at engagement and a quick turnaround of some sort of meaningful information that could perhaps contribute to our report?
Gathering that information just now, we would hope over the next quarter to have gathered, or 2 months to have gathered the information in a higher level kind of scope study of where we think unauthorised encampments are lying. The trends in unauthorised encampments over the past 3 years, we're looking at that. In terms, you said, as the dialogue and how that would affect the travellers community, is that we are working to bring, we use the Scottish Police College to run development days for police officers, partners and gypsy travellers to come together to look at how we form our policy and procedures. That is looking to be developed to try and capture the wider gypsy traveller community, give them a greater voice. That's just getting scoped just now. But I would hope over the next 2 months that we will have captured much of this information to take us forward in the new police service. So if we can be of any assistance and provide any information, don't hesitate to contact me or task me.
I'm going to bring in Gavin, Buist and then Lynne, Tammi.
Yeah, actually just building on what Mr Finney and Alec have said, and trying to kind of capture some of the comments that were made earlier. The focus does seem to be on the roadside encampments, and I can entirely understand why. My own experience, which is limited, of the permanent sites is exactly as has been described by this committee this morning. They're not in ideal places. They tend to be off the bus routes. They tend not to be local health centres, not to be near local schools, not to be near services. And I think one of the members to my right used the term NIMBYism, and perhaps that's why these places are where they are, and I think we have to be fairly frank about that. I think in terms of roadside encampments, they have different characters. There are different types of roadside encampments, but I wonder sometimes if some of them become unofficially established because they offer that kind of access that the official sites don't offer. The ones I've had dealings with tend to be in kind of semi-urban areas. They're near the arterial routes. They do give access to town centres, to bus routes and so on. And perhaps a starting point would be to ask travelling people themselves, what do you actually want out of an encampment site? And then move on from that perspective, because I'm quite sure if they were given the courtesy of being sat down and asked to design, in the abstract perhaps, tell us what an ideal permanent site looks like, it probably wouldn't be what the existing ones look like.
Thanks for that. Lynne, Tammi?
Words right out of my mouth there, because I was going to shift the focus back to planning and planning processes, and that kind of sums it up in a nutshell, if you like, about actually asking the people that you're allegedly making provision for. I mean, Kathryn knows much more about the planning processes than I do, but certainly for us, the key to it is about going back to first principles and building the capacity. We work essentially with young people, so building the capacity of young people so that they actually understand planning processes. So not just about saying to people, okay, come along to a meeting and we want to ask you what you want and draw us a picture and, you know, show us the ideal site. It's about them actually having all the knowledge, access to all the knowledge, so that they can actually fully participate, whether that's, you know, national meetings or whatever, but also at the local level, also to be involved in looking at local development plans, where traveller sites come into that. We're working with Plan and Aid Scotland at the moment and trying to develop a resource around that. But that takes time. We need time to develop that, the young people themselves involved with Kathryn's organisation. But these kind of things take time and resources if that's to be rolled out across Scotland, so you don't end up with an elite group of young people or whatever that are seen as the group that get trotted out every time to speak on behalf of the community. But, I mean, in terms of planning processes and how that works, I would hand to Kathryn, because it's her area of expertise.
Kathryn, did you want to come in on that, and then I'll move on to Pauline, Padfield?
I think the point Lynne made about the development plan is that when we've been doing work with Gypsy Travellers, the only thing that maybe they're thinking about is a planning application, maybe looking for their own site. But they do have a right to get involved, as everybody does, to get involved in the development plan for their area, both in terms of potentially putting forward a site, but also influencing what goes on around their sites or where other sites might be. And I think it's really important for them to actually make sure that they get involved at that stage. And as Lynne mentioned, we're looking at doing more training with young people, young Gypsy travellers, to help them understand how do they get involved in the planning process and when's the right time to get involved, because often in planning people miss the opportunities to get involved, and sometimes it's too late by the time people do get involved. So yeah, we'd really like to take that forward.
One Colleagues on the STEP team is Mhairi Henry, who has a lot of experience in this area. And Mhairi is about to start doing a piece of work with East Ayrshire on finding out what the travellers would like in terms of their accommodation there. So that work hasn't started yet, but we could possibly, come back to you with that.
Thanks for that. John, sorry, Dennis.
Just on planning. Planning is complex, and it's complicated for the majority of people. Is there a possibility that we could have someone dedicated from planning to work with the Gypsy travelling community to not just explain, but to take them through the process at a tenuous period in time? Because for most people, planning is a nightmare. Maybe not for people working planning, of course, but for the rest of us.
I think that one's for you, Kathryn.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a planning advice service. It's a free advice service that anybody can call anytime. Individuals, communities can call us up for free advice. We do get a lot of inquiries from Gypsy travellers. We're not a consultancy. We don't do things for people. We give people the skills to do those things themselves. So we do work with a lot of Gypsy travellers through our advice service.
That's a problem in some respects, because a lot of people within the Gypsy travelling communities may not have the skills to enable that process to happen.
Yeah, and that's why we're really trying to build up those skills through our training as well. And as Lynne was talking about, we're looking at doing a project with young Gypsy travellers, so that they're going to be the ones that actually in the future are doing the planning applications, putting the representations into development plans. So if we can really train the young people and really get them really understanding what the process is and breaking it down for them, any of our training we try and break it down and make it as easy to understand as possible, because it is very complicated, the planning process. So if we can do that now and really work with young people, hopefully in the future those things won't be so much of a problem.
And Tammi, did you want to come in on that point?
Kathryn said, actually, I was just going to add to that that's what we're looking at, is building a resource that can be multiplied by young Gypsy travellers, not only to their peers, but also to older people within the community, and particularly explain to older people that may have literacy issues or whatever. So it's to get it out as widely as possible, because as you rightly say, it's complicated, it's a minefield. So you need to understand the underpinnings of it before you can start to become involved in the process.
John, do you have any further questions on that before I move on?
No, just a deep sense of frustration that we just go round and round in circles. I have to say, and I'm not for 1 minute questioning that everyone's acting in good faith, but so my question about whether this ultimately becomes more a national rather than a local issue, I think, ministerial leadership on this issue may in the end prove important and galvanise a lot of the good work that's taking place all over.
Thanks for that. I'm going to move on now to Michelle. Did you want to come in on that point before I move on?
Firstly, just to echo John's comment about going round in circles, that's certainly ringing bells for lots of people, I suspect, but also the need for national leadership. Others who've given evidence have mentioned that in the past, and I think it's so obvious in the case of accommodation. Just one other thing I wanted to mention. Pauline and others mentioned and the need to speak to Gypsy travellers, which in a sense it goes without saying that should be at the core of any accommodation strategy or recommendation. But there are a number of accommodation needs assessments that have been done over the last 10 years by a variety of organisations in a range of different ways. To my knowledge, none of the recommendations from these assessments have actually been implemented, and they're big documents, very glossy-looking documents. I think there is scope to go back to Gypsy travellers and ask people what they want, but I think there's also a time, as John said earlier, a lot of people actually just want something pretty basic, and I think the time is ready to have a few pilots throughout the country. Try something. There is enough evidence there about what many people would like, and there's a desperate need for some action rather than more research.
Thanks for that. I'm going to move on now to John Mason and then Marco Biagi.
And I think my point, it does follow on from this. It's not a completely different point. The points were made earlier about attitude, and I completely agree with that, and that applies to loads and loads of things, that we really want to change people's attitudes ultimately although that can take a long time. And I'd be interested to know if people have ideas as to how we change the attitude. Is it through the schools and just work up? Because the media clearly, in some ways, reflects public attitudes as well, or should we be tackling? But linked to that, then, the idea of the national against the local, which John and others have mentioned recently. You know, so I suppose, you know, you take another issue like, say, smoking. You've had both trying to change the attitude through education, and you've had quite dramatic legislation from the centre. And I mean, the centre could say, you know, at a national level, we could say, right, every local authority must produce one permanent transit site, if that's the right term, within 2 years, right? So something really concrete, solid, absolutely. But my feeling is there might be reaction against that locally, because that might not be appropriate. So I'm interested in how we try and tie these together, the national against the local.
I'd like to kick off on that one.
I think it's about the national against the local. I think that's the key partnership. At local level, when people are trying to get things changed, they look to the for national leadership. And national leadership, when trying to find out about things, look to people in the local level. So there has to be not an against, but a partnership between.
Well, could I just press you, though, on what do you mean by national leadership? I mean, do you mean that Alex Salmond stands up and says Gypsy Travellers are a good thing? Or do you mean we enforce councils to create sites, which they're not doing?
Well, I think what Michelle has said is important, is that the information is being gathered, so it needs to be looked at to see what actually is said here. We've already done this. A lot of travellers would say, oh, we've done this already, I can't be bothered, because their day-to-day lives are already a struggle, and it takes a lot of energy to keep this sort of thing going. So I'm not going to say, well, I think Alex Salmond or somebody else should stand up. I'm not engaged at that level, but this clearly is a national level. So if some dialogue between the national, in this sense, and people who are on the ground, to make sure that recommendations on what has been said are in fact affected. So I would like to go back to the point about if somebody was to write in the newspaper about other ethnic groups, what they write about Gypsy travellers, it wouldn't be allowed. Well, why is it allowed? Perhaps that might be a way to start on changing attitudes. And I was very heartened to hear that a newspaper had been brought and suggested that their work was falling below acceptable standards. So I can't come up with a nice potted answer, but the stuff's there, and the dialogue that the police people here have been mentioning is the approach. So the evidence is being gathered, people with lots of experience are in place, new people are coming in. Planning Aid Scotland's contribution is extremely helpful. So it's all there, but it somehow has to be pulled together and find out if things are actually happening.
Thanks for that. Lynne, Tammi, and I don't know, Michelle, did you want to come in on that specific point as well? I'll bring in Lynne and then you, Michelle.
Agreeing with Pauline on a lot of what she says, but I think that leadership in terms of, you know, the old argument of silence is complicity, and I think there really does have to be leadership. We've discussed this at Council of Europe level, and people have in turn made statements around that, because I think national statements have to be made that this is certainly not acceptable, because some sections of the mainstream media, and indeed I'm fairly certain that the publication you're referring to is one that we are actually tracking at the moment, and not much has changed there. So this is where the messages have to come from government to say this just isn't acceptable, and from that then we can begin to measure, and then we can start to challenge and look at change amongst that, because the discrimination and the prejudice is core to the argument. It's core to stopping people coming forward. It's also core, as Pauline mentioned there, about we've done this. There was this amount of recommendations, was that amount of recommendations, but there needs to be some sort of action. But that also needs to be coupled with what's often termed as awareness raising or building bridges, and you did mention that we do that through schools. We need to look at many different ways of doing that to make sure that we're reaching out to everyone. Schools is an example. We've been working in schools, young people going in, but not just going in and speaking about their culture, actually engaging their peers from the settled community in conflict resolution activities. So it really is about getting to the heart of the matter and recognising and naming this as a conflict and looking at ways of dealing with this. That's difficult, it takes time, it takes resources. So although we need statements in terms of leadership, we also need commitment in terms of financial commitment, because I don't know how much finance is going into making changes for the community or dealing with conflict, but I'm fairly certain it's not a lot. And I know times are difficult, but this is a difficult situation, it's an issue, and it's an issue of conflict, and if we want to address that and have positive outcomes for all of society, then we need to make sure that we're putting the appropriate resources in and the appropriate leadership style statements are being made.
Thanks for that. I've got Michelle Lloyd, Helen Watson, and then Mhairi Craig wanted to come in on that point.
On your point in terms of how do we change attitudes, I would agree with others that there isn't one way, it's a multi-pronged approach. There needs to be work in schools, obviously. There needs to be work through awareness raising training. There needs to be work with the Gypsy Traveller community so that they feel comfortable to get involved in meetings, whether it's at local development plans or whether it's coming along to events like this. If you've been on the receiving end of decades, centuries of discrimination, the last thing you're going to do is want to get engaged with the process. Why should you? It's easier sometimes just to keep your head down and get on with your life. I think there is a need for strong leadership, both statements but also action. There have been statements in the past. There haven't been very many champions at a very senior level. There's certainly a need for that. There is a need, I think, to use the existing international and domestic legislation that we have. Some of it is there. It's not being implemented as effectively as it could be.
Can I question that? I mean, are you saying there should be maybe prosecutions of media that haven't happened?
Yes, but I would say not just the media. I mean, some of the examples of racist reporting, discriminatory practice are so blatant, it beggars belief at times. And one doesn't have to look far to find these examples. But I think it's also, the media play a part, they play an important part. But in our experience of working with Gypsy Traveller carers, what is also shocking is the level of discriminatory attitude that we're seeing among service providers. The regular breaches of confidentiality, regular making assumptions about families, making comments which are completely unacceptable and would not be made about other minority ethnic communities. But it's somehow deemed to be acceptable to say about Gypsy travellers. So those can be tackled within our own institutions, because I don't think they're unique to the social care and health sector. They are within the other professions, some of whom are represented around the table. So I think it needs to be. In the past, the government have tackled a number of sensitive issues through what used to be called public education campaigns, through advertising, through ministers making strong statements. All of that is needed in relation to Gypsy travellers.
Thanks for that, Helen, and then Mhairi.
Yes, thanks. It's probably, in some respects, adding to what Lynne and Michelle have already said. I think we do need to recognise that there is conflict here, and we've recognised around this table that we shouldn't be making assumptions about what Gypsy travellers want or need. We should be asking them. Likewise, I don't think we should be making assumptions about what is at the root of the prejudice that we see so explicitly exhibited at times. I think maybe we should be trying to get underneath that and identify the building blocks to kind of take those apart, because I'm concerned that it's great if we've got strong national leadership, But if that's to filter down through the system, then, you know, we need a route for that to go. There's already been reference made to NIMBYism, and if we're saying that gypsy travellers are a good thing, they add, you know, new dimensions and new learning into local cultures, which they do. But then if you've got this NIMBYism and we're wanting to get a site set up somewhere, it puts local elected members often in an uncomfortable position where they're having to challenge the attitudes and the prejudices within their community. And I know that that's part of their job, but it's still hard, and you need a strong support network behind you to be able to do that effectively. So I think we need to be in schools, but we also need to be talking to communities in a wider sense and trying to find out what are the myths that build up the stigmas and the prejudices, so that we can start to dismantle that.
Thanks for that, Barry.
I just want to say I do agree with what Michelle said. The report that you were involved in, that basically my post was set up on back of, still I'm not aware that anything from that report has actually been actioned, and that was 3.5 years ago. And I do think that with the travellers that I work with, I think if somebody was to go back to them yet again and say, right, what is it that you want, what can we do for you, they would... It's not an apathy, but it is just a, well, why should we bother? Because we've done this before, nothing's happened. So, you know, they've got a hard enough life, they've got enough to be getting on with without having to deal with all this yet again and yet again. And I think that with awareness raising, it needs to be, I think sometimes it maybe needs to be just a bit more forceful. And like there's awareness raising done in schools with teachers, but it's on CTP, which isn't mandatory, so it doesn't get attended very well. There's one today actually that Article 12 are involved in as well. But you know, I think maybe if organisations made it more mandatory that they had to go to these sessions, you know, people might be a bit more aware.
Thank you for that, Gavin. Buist.
Yeah, I think Barry just used a very important word, and that is awareness. I've listened with great interest to the discussion about that Mr Mason initiated, and just picking out the various words there: individual champions, there's leadership, media. We have, I think, at the moment, and I'm going to pick my words carefully here because I'm in slightly unfamiliar territory. I think what I pick up in relation to gypsy travellers in Scotland is there is a public discourse at the moment that doesn't condemn what Lynne and Pauline are talking about. Now, I talked earlier on about drawing some comfort from previous successes. If I look back to when I joined the service, which is now 32 years ago, and I look at people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds, LGBT backgrounds, people from a disabled background, and I look now at the positive role models from an LGBT context, from a race context. We look at the Paralympics, there are some fantastic role models for disabled people there who simply weren't on the radar 30 odd years ago. And I make that point because I think in Scotland what we have shown is we can do this. But that leadership is absolutely vital in making it happen. I don't see why in the abstract we can't do this with gypsy traveller people. But there needs to be, I think, these key words, the leadership, role models, particular champions. We know how to do it because we've achieved it with certain groups, and I don't see why we can't do it with this additional part of the community.
Thanks for that. I've got Pauline, Padfield.
Just like to say that I agree with all of the things that people have said, and yes, there does need to be leadership. The idea of me telling Alex Salmon threw me for a minute. But where STEP has chosen to focus its resources has been in supporting teachers of travelling children. And what we noticed was a growth from about 9 local authorities actively having a service to more interest up to about 21 local authorities. That's dropped down to 19 now, and we noticed that among the teams, and there may be one person or possibly 3, in Fife there are 3, there are not enough people on the ground to be able to do the race awareness that's required in schools. These people do a really good job, but with the best will in the world, they've also got the job of supporting the families getting into school. So there's a double task there that falls on people who are having less hours at their disposal to carry out their jobs. So in terms of the outcomes that you were talking about earlier, that's possibly an important area to look at. And I've noted that maybe some research into how those outcomes have been achieved over the last few years in terms of gypsy travellers would be yet again evidence of how, despite the rhetoric, there has to be the people on the ground to do the work. And if staff cutting or not filling in of posts at that level is the way forward, well, we're going to have more problems of racist treatment of travellers, not less.
Lynne, Tammi wanting to come in, and then Jarrett.
It's just to add to, there was a mention, it was Mhairi that mentioned there about work in schools and awareness raising in schools. I think it is important to mention examples of good practice, and the University of Dundee is actually, they've just recently included a module in terms of working with gypsy traveller families into their MSc social work course. So we've been involved in that. This is just happening at the moment, so obviously that needs to be evaluated and what have you. But this, I've never been able to understand why that hasn't been core in the teaching of social work, community learning and development workers, or indeed teachers. It's easy enough to pull a module together, but it really does give people a good starting point for when they go into the field, because I think a lot of this is about not sure, don't understand, afraid to contact, and then, you know, there's the barriers are up again, and then we get the negative stereotyping and what have you. So this again is something that we should be looking at, that it's embedded in professional learning and development.
Thanks for that. Jarrett?
Yeah, I think I'm getting a flavour for that. There's a lot of good work going on, and John mentioned about the community planning partnerships. I'm of the opinion that there is an infrastructure in place to deliver what you want to deliver in terms of community planning partnerships, single outcome agreements, local community planning that goes on. We've got a move towards empowering communities, but these are happening in the context of local community planning partnerships throughout the country. What Michelle and Gavin mentioned about a champion, it seems to be that we need at a higher governmental level, strategic level, a champion to pull together what this committee will undoubtedly produce, hopefully, an action plan of best practice, good work, shortcomings, outcomings that tie into everything, but we need a champion to take this national action plan together and work with ongoing community planning partnerships and other partners to ensure it gets delivered consistently and coherently across the country. That I would say, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, we just need someone at a strategic governmental level to say, I will be the champion, you produce me with the framework, the action plan, and I will drive it forward with all the contributing partners.
To echo what Lynne was saying, that's really heartening to know what Dundee are doing. That's fabulous, and I think if that was rolled out amongst universities and colleges, just to mainstream awareness of gypsy traveller communities would be fantastic. The way that awareness of mental health and disability is mainstream now, so I think that would be a wonderful thing to do.
Thank you. Dennis, did you have a brief supplementary on this?
It was partly on this, but yes, I'm happy to wait if you've got someone else coming in.
John, did you want to come back in on the subject that you raised before I move on?
No, not really. I mean, I think I share John's frustration when he used that word, I think, earlier on, and you know, but I mean, there's been some good comments, I think, about how we can actually do this, because I think I'm interested in that. How can we actually take this forward?
Onto that. Dennis, do you want to come in with your supplementary, and then I'll move on to
basically, yeah, we've heard about the media once or twice, you know, and people are making comments, but no one's been very specific about the media as such. you know, we heard about, you know, some of the newspapers, but how much damage is being done by the media in portraying programmes like, and forgive me for not remembering the title because I'm very bad at these things because I never watched the programme, but it's a sort of gypsy weddings. I'm sure there's some other title, but that's portrayed on television, which gives you a portrayal of Gypsy Travelling Live, which isn't particularly real, in my opinion anyway, from what I've heard. So, is there a lot of damage being done in terms of this creates an image with the public?
Sure, people say it's put back 10 years racism against them. They're not gypsy travellers, but the flack that they've experienced as a consequence of those programmes has really distressed and disheartened them.
Jill?
There's a piece of research that I can forward to the committee that was carried out by Show Racism the Red Card. They deliver awareness raising training about the issues affecting Roma Gypsy traveller communities within schools, and they were recently doing some work in Perth and Kinross, and before they run their session they ask the young people, what do you know or what do you think when you hear the word Roma Gypsy traveller? The vast majority of comments from their most recent session related to things that come up through the programme, and I think it's best not to mention its name so it doesn't get any more publicity. But I'll certainly forward that to the committee.
That would be very useful, Michelle, thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on that particular point? Lynne?
It's echo what has already been said here, but there's the issues around, I don't know, I'm sure people will probably have read about this also, the more serious issue, if you like, about the sexualising or sexualisation of children in the advertising of these types of car crash TV programmes, and that's an issue that has been pursued, but it takes us full circle back to, would the children of any other community be used and portrayed in such a manner to sell television? I don't think so. So it goes us right back to what's acceptable and what is not acceptable. And no, I won't mention the name of these programmes either.
Thank you for that. I'll remain
I think that's best, Dennis. I think that's best.
Me and people said that.
I'll now move on to Marco Biagi with, I think, our final question of this session.
Well, I was going to ask about leadership, but a lot of that's been covered already. Just to follow on from what John Mason was saying about what national leadership might look like, is it the case, based on what I've heard, that you would characterise generally that local leadership has either failed or not succeeded, depending on whether you're glass half empty or glass half full? And if it hasn't succeeded, why hasn't it? And what would be different about national leadership that would mean national leadership would work where local leadership manifestly hadn't?
Who would like to start that one?
I think it's about mainstreaming, and national leadership would be, if it was in the media and it was more mainstreamed, then I think it would be more acceptable to the communities in general.
Thank you for that. Kathryn?
I think from a planning perspective, plans always sort of pass down from the national level down to the sort of strategic level down to the local level, and there's very little national level planning guidance related to planning for gypsy travellers. So I think if there was the national level guidance, it would filter down a lot better to the local level.
Anyone else want to come in on that?
There's a little bit of a contradiction going on here as to how you actually achieve mainstreaming without focusing on, I suppose the arguments were all around the Equality Act 2010. I remember the discussions that there were consistent strategic things among lots of groups, so a new law which would cover, but then how do you talk about the particular instances? And that's maybe the difficulty, is how you discuss these things equally so that you don't forget that gypsy travellers have planning needs or access to healthcare and medicine. You do need to have a particular focus, but it has to be part of the general discussion and not forgotten about and left off the agenda. Maybe that's it, that people's agendas need to be clear. Have you considered all of the groups that you may be working with?
Certainly, I'll bring in Kathryn and then Alex, Jarrett.
Just in terms of the Equality Act, I think all plans and policies now, including planning documents, need to be equality impact assessed, and I think that's kind of coming in at the moment, and I think that would make quite a big difference, because obviously the different groups that are being worked with will need to be assessed in planning documents.
I'll bring in Alex and then I'll come to you, Nigel, okay?
I think it's sure. It's a national issue that stretches across the country, and it requires national direction and national grip to drive it forward. It's as simple as that for me.
I believe that from 2005, Gypsy Travellers were given, through various test cases, formal recognition as a distinct ethnic group, which means the Race Relations Amendment Act 2000 kicked in 2005, so perhaps we shouldn't necessarily focus on the Equality Act 2010 forward. We should perhaps be looking from 2005 forward. In terms of leadership, I think a lot of very informed and positive comments have been made. My only suggestion would be that encouragement to the local authorities and positive encouragement is perhaps better than wielding a big stick.
Mark, would you want to, do you have any follow-up questions?
Where do people see the role of community councils in resolving this issue?
I think it's quite judging Fora and community councils were here the other week, and it was interesting to read their commentary, and a lot of that we covered earlier about saying that they didn't understand the culture, they didn't understand the traditions of Gypsy Travellers, and perhaps that would help. Community councils do have a role in as much as they do, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Kathryn, and that they do have a role in overseeing or certainly commenting on certain planning issues and what have you in their area. So obviously they need to be brought into the fold, they need to be engaged. But we need to go back to first principles, I think, with many community councils, judging by the comments in the report of the last meeting, because the majority were quite negative, and my assessment of that is that's based on a lack of understanding of the community, but also, just to go back to the issue around mainstream media, that is what's being fed. Negativity, stereotyping, it's been fed on a daily basis by not just Scottish dailies but also UK dailies. So people need to be able to be encouraged to see beyond that, and we're only going to do that by, again, it's about looking at how we involve people, how we engage them, bringing the communities together, but at the very basics, getting the information out so that people can make informed decisions. But when all said and done, if they're representing a community, they have to put their personal assumptions or beliefs aside, and it's about looking, and so it's about, I suppose, also about making the point that community councils, elected representatives, whether that's local or national, have a duty to represent and consider all citizens in their area, not just the few or the majority, if you like.
Does anyone else want to come in on that particular point? Michelle?
It's not on that point. It's the previous point.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Okay.
I think I always get slightly worried when we hear the word mainstreaming because I think it's been used and abused over the years. And whilst I'd be the first one to say that it may be a goal that we could aspire to in terms of hopefully Gypsy Travellers being one of the many communities that come up in history lessons or social work courses or whatever, I think we also need to remember the reality where there are shocking statistics in terms of health inequalities. The conditions on sites, as you have seen yourself, are appalling in the 21st century in Scotland. And because of that, I don't think it's enough to have an equality impact assessment which simply has Gypsy Travellers there as one of the communities, because it's too easy just to tick that box. And as we know from the previous inquiry, the 2001 inquiry, there has been, the progress has been negligible across most of the areas that that inquiry covered. So I do think there is a need for I hesitate to use sort of special or whatever, but there needs to be a very targeted approach to address the multiplicity of issues that are coming up. And I think it does need leadership at a national level, which will hopefully be followed up at a local level, because a local approach may be needed. What's happening in Aberdeen is very different to what's happening in Oban, for example, and vice versa. And there are local approaches which are needed in terms of building capacity with the Gypsy Traveller communities, because they vary obviously from area to area. But I do think there is a definite need for strong national leadership, but also resourcing, because as others have said, there are examples of good practice. There are some of the materials that colleague from NHS Glasgow mentioned about dispelling myths or awareness raising training materials. Some of those examples do exist, but they exist in pockets. They're very often delivered by the third sector. And the third sector in the current climate are on a shoestring, you know, so that it needs to be properly resourced and a programme of work.
Thank you for that, Michelle. Does anyone else want to come in on that specific point? Helen.
Thank you. Again, on that point, I mean, health inequalities we know are huge. We haven't actually been able to properly quantify them. There are some structural problems, I think, in terms of when we look at the number of GPs willing to register Gypsy Travellers, and they are independent contractors, they can refuse. But I think the primary reason that GPs will refuse is around clinical governance, because of the follow-through and duty of care, and we haven't got that sorted, and I think that needs to be sorted on a national basis as well. It probably needs to be part of the GP contract, because, again, that would facilitate a follow-through in the system. I mean, Michelle mentioned the third sector and our reliance on the third sector. I actually see that as a really positive thing, because it can act as a buffer and help to maybe mitigate some of the mistrust that's the Gypsy Travellers feel towards the statutory services. But I think it's patchy across the country as well in terms of how well the statutory services embrace that role of the third sector. And, you know, you mentioned the third sector being on a shoestring, so is the statutory sector now. So we're all in the same boat. But, you know, actually maybe that's an opportunity to pool limited resources and try and find a way forward through that.
Thanks for
third sector. I would never say that it's not good, that there's good work going on there, but it does need to be resourced, because quite often it's a choice between supporting and assisting a family who are in a very desperate situation or coming along to a community planning meeting, and that's not a nice choice to make.
Marco, do you have any further questions for the witnesses? One thing that we've not really covered this morning, and I would be interested in the witnesses' views, is the role of the Gypsy Traveller Liaison Officers. And I would be interested in whether or not you think they perform a worthwhile role, what involvement you have had with them, and whether or not you think that the role should be enhanced in some way, and if it should be enhanced, in what way? So, I throw it open to the witnesses. Linda.
With everything else, similar to everything else, all the other provisions for the community, it's patchy because not every local authority area has a Gypsy Traveller Liaison Officer or a GTLO. Some areas that have sites have site managers who cover that role, if you like, have a dual role. Some have site managers that specifically are engaged with work on the site, and that's it. So that is the first point. It's difficult to compare, contrast, measure when the service is not across the board. GTLOs that we've worked with, and that's not across the whole of Scotland, we found them to be helpful in terms of engaging with us in the third sector, and enabling us to, I'll give Clinterty as an example because we've done quite a bit of work with the GTLO up there, who also operates as a site manager and covers the area as well, which is a lot of work, I think, and I think it would be better if that person didn't have that dual role, because, you know, certainly when there's a lot of roadside camps going on, a lot of people passing through, our job can become quite difficult. So that's one issue. I would like to see GTLOs in every region in the country, but with a set remit, if you like, so that they had something that they could measure against, that they could come together as a group and look at works, how things are going, what things need to be changed. I would like to see that happening. It's moving away slightly, but it is relevant because some site managers are operating as GTLOs. I know that it would have been good if there'd been someone from site managers here, perhaps. I don't know if you're going to be speaking to site managers. Where was I going with this? I've completely lost track of what I was saying. Yeah, so I mean, I think it would be good to have networks that you know, that solid networks that they could come together and information could be shared. We're looking at, I know times are tight and people are finding it difficult to assign finances to such posts, but they are important and they're also a good point of contact for the community itself because they're there on a permanent basis. Relationships can be built between it, so they're a good third way, if you like, of making contact with the community when the trust has been built. But that is why there needs to be permanent, it needs to be across the country so that trust can be built.
Thank you for that one. I don't want to make what I'm going to say sound negative, but STEP's work with teachers of travelling children, we've just done. It's been very hard to gather information at local authority about what actually is being provided for in other services. It's been hard sometimes to actually find enough good practice to feel there is good practice, but enough to feel confident that things are going well. But we've never heard anybody mention a Gypsy Traveller Liaison Officer except in one local authority. And I know the person. He's been a Gypsy Traveller Liaison for many years, and he's crucial in helping the educators there to make contact with travelling people. But no, I've never heard any other local authority mentioning a Gypsy Traveller Liaison Officer. But it was a very strong plank, wasn't it, in the 35 recommendations. I'm conscious of being present. I was new into the field then, but the sense of excitement there was among people about those 37 recommendations. So it kind of reinforces what you've said, Michelle. The discussions I've had, some of the shapes might have changed a bit, but we're not managing to deliver what needs to be delivered.
Thank you for that. Do any of the other witnesses want to comment on that question?
Yeah. I mean, I also was around at the time of the last inquiry, and I do remember the recommendation very clearly saying that the role of site manager and GTLO should be distinct. And that has happened in only a handful of local authorities. I think we're also talking, one of the reasons I think that recommendation was made is because we're actually talking about different skill sets and different knowledge as well. And managing an accommodation facility and potentially having an enforcement role in relation to roadside camps, in my mind, is quite different from being able to provide a social care, health, education type liaison role. Yeah. It requires a different background. So I think it's difficult to assess the situation when there are differing remits and differing approaches within local authorities. I think there is also room for independent liaison, and I know this is something that came up in previous sessions, where a liaison role is provided by somebody in the third sector, because I think they do have that independence and they are able to maybe tackle issues within a local, or poor practice within a local authority, where a site manager stroke GTLO might find it difficult to do that. Going back to your point about whether it should be an enhanced role, I'm not sure. I think there is. I'd rather see any additional investment or resources, if they were available, go into capacity building within the Gypsy Traveller community, because in my experience, a lot of the role of liaison officers, whether they come from the third sector or the local authority, is actually facilitating access to services for Gypsy travellers, which in an ideal world people would be able to access those services without the need of an intermediary. So I think it's a difficult one there, and I'd like to see more investment in the capacity building side of it.
Thanks for that, Barry Craig.
I mean, certainly my job seems to have developed a lot into doing that, doing liaison work, and I work quite closely with the site managers, but there has definitely, over the years that I've been doing the job, it's very, very obvious that there is a need for somebody independent from the local authority. And I mean, I've had a lot of good feedback and good reaction to the job that I've done. So I agree that definitely it's something that should be across the board.
Thank you. Helen.
Yeah, I think we have to be very, very precise about what the role should be. Because if you think about the different sizes of local authority, you know, if you compare Clackmannanshire with Glasgow City, for example, then, you know, for each authority area to have one GTLO will, by definition, augment what those officers can achieve. We probably have to look at geographical spread as well. Because, you know, if you've got a GTLO that's driving up and down Argyll, it'll take all day to drive from one end to the other. So I think it really needs to be a wee bit more sophisticated than just, you know, each local authority must have a GTLO.
Could you do by health board?
Again, there are huge variations in the size of...
Oh, absolutely, but I mean, it's smaller within the health board context than it is in the local authority.
I actually
a much wider...
I think maybe the better way to look at it is actually to look at the patterns of movement of the Gypsy traveller population and build up an infrastructure around that.
Yeah, that's right. Okay,
thank you. Pauline, Padfield.
This today is about accommodation, and so STEP's role sits on the edge a little bit here. But it struck me it's important to mention in education that the partnership attempts to work well together have flown from the institution of the Getting It Right for Every Child GERFEC approach. And we do find evidence that, again, is patchy, and it depends on how many people are on the ground, of educators actually being the central person in that team, because often it's the teacher that's closest to a Gypsy traveller family. So in that sense, a Gypsy traveller liaison officer may be more relevant where you're talking about accommodation rather than about education. But in practice, I think what tends to happen is there are different people who have different roles, and in working together, they find that helpful. If they pick the phone up, then those connections can be made.
Can I ask the witnesses that are representing the police if they have had any involvement with GTLOs and what their view of the role of the GTLO is?
I think I would defer to the gentleman at the bottom.
Alex.
Yes, I've found from personal experience and from colleagues it's a very useful role as someone who has formed relationships. That's a conduit. We have police officers who are liaison officers as well within their area, and you'll find it throughout the country. There'll either be community police officers with responsibility for a geographic area who will assume that roles. Some divisions or areas will have champions that work with liaison officers, and we have found it, and I have personally in the past, as a constant kind of personality there that's formed relationships, built relationships, and assists the police, who can have a fairly moving landscape of kind of personnel, as someone that we can access, and it saves us building bridges again and again and again. And in terms of accessing people, working in relation to unauthorised encampments, forming better relationships, we find it very useful, but I totally agree there has to be some discussion around what is that role for different partners. I think it can develop where in different areas it develops depending on the personality and the local authorities' focus a wee bit there, but I think it should be enhanced and kept.
Do any of the other witnesses have any brief comments they want to make on that specific point? Mr Mackay?
Yeah, Jarrett's saying certainly I've only been in my current post for 2 months, but in that short time I've managed to get round the different borders, East Lothian, West Lothian and so on. And they all run the liaison officer model slightly differently. I think the borders is a sort of consultancy call-out type thing. Edinburgh's got a dedicated one. But whatever the setup, I have to say my view and my limited view of them so far is it's been entirely positive. I think they work well with our designated police liaison officers, particularly on site visits to unauthorised encampments and so on. And I think I'm trying to visualise that visit without a council liaison officer and a police officer going of themselves. I think that would have a detrimental effect.
Do any committee members have any further brief questions? And I emphasise the word brief questions for our witnesses. No. Thank you. Can I then thank our witnesses this morning for coming along and giving us your evidence? I think it's been a very useful session. It's also been a very positive session this morning, I think. And if I have to take away one message from this morning, that would be the message about leadership. But it has been a very good session, and can I thank you all for coming along. And that concludes our formal meeting this morning. Our next meeting will take place on Thursday the 24th of January and will include oral evidence from local authorities at a strategic level on where gypsy travellers live. So thank you very much.
Okay.